Hey, how's it going? Hey, so my name's Zach. If I haven't met you yet, I would love to meet you afterwards tonight. Come find me. I'm trying to get to know everyone that's here, and I'm part of the student ministries team here. You've seen some of my friends up here on stage tonight with Steven and Josh, and Sam's part of our team, and we have some amazing hub group leaders that are in this room right now, and so I'm just privileged to be a part of this team here, and privileged to get to share a little bit with you tonight on what God's been showing me. But first, can we just thank Jared for being here tonight with singing for us, man? Man, what a blessing. That was awesome. He's the worship pastor at a different church in San Luis Obispo, and he's like, yeah, I'll come sing with some middle schoolers on a Tuesday night and at a different church that's not his. And so I loved it. I loved that he was here with us tonight. That was awesome. And so I want to ask you guys a question tonight. And I might know the answer already, but maybe not. Is there anyone out there, anyone at all in this room who loves to talk? See over here, someone didn't even raise their hand. There's like, I have an addiction to talking, and they started talking. So so the talkers in this room, right? And I think for some of us that didn't raise our hands, we're still pretty big talkers. It just depends on the situation, right? You may not think of yourself as a big talker from stage, but I guess that in almost every single one of your stories, there is at least one or two things that you will go on and on and on and on about if placed in the right situation. For most of you that are pretty quiet, my guess is that if you were with your best friend, you might be a little bit more talkative than if you're in just a big group of strangers, true? Or maybe if it's the right subject, you will talk about it forever. Like for some of you, you might be really into the TV show The Flash, right? And yeah, he's fast, okay? And so you might be really into like you may not be a big talker, but then someone brings up The Flash, and you're like, excuse me, Barry Allen is clearly faster than the electrical arc of the lightning bolt, and the wavelengths haven't even matched his speed. And I got to tell you about season 2, episode 1, when Barry Allen goes to the little hotel that he goes to, and then there's a hotel, and then he runs out of the hotel, and he runs super fast because he's got to save the world from that thing. And I'm getting really good at that ramble game, right? And you just go on and on and on and on and on because it was something that you were interested in. What if it's something like some of you are really into sports, right? And so if the subject of basketball comes up, you're like, well, I can tell you all about Steph Curry. I can tell you his middle name. I can tell you, not Warriors fans in here. Okay, so you might talk about Steph Curry. You might be able to talk about all these different facts about people. For some of you, maybe you're really into Taylor Swift's music, and you know every single song. You know every single song about my girl Tay-Tay. Like, you know every ex-boyfriend she has. You know their names. You know their addresses. You've got her birthday marked on your calendar, and you want everyone to know how great she is. Maybe you're really into the World Beard and Mustache Championships. For some reason, I don't know. And so you might be really into seeing grown men grow weird facial hair. I don't know. But you might know every contestant in the World Beard Championships. And if that subject comes up, boy, you are going to talk about it. So, for all of us, there's at least one subject where we really like to talk about it if it's brought up. For me, one subject that I love to talk about is music. I love music, and I like to think I have a decent taste in music. When I was in college, I loved going to concerts down in Long Beach. I still go to concerts when I can now, but there's less concerts in this area than there were like in the Los Angeles area. And so I love to talk to people about some of my favorite bands like Switchfoot or a rapper named NF. And I will talk about some of my favorite musicians and artists and those kinds of things. But here's the thing. I can't play an instrument, like at all. And I can't sing. Like if I sing, like if I try to do what Jared just did, like all the glass everywhere in the world starts breaking, right? And yet, even though I can't do those things, I can't play an instrument, I can't sing, I still know some about music. And it's a start, right? There's plenty of it I don't know, but I still know something. And so the things that you love, you don't know everything possible there is to know about it, and yet you have no problem talking about it. And yet for some of you, you would say, I love God. I love God. And yet when it's pressed to talk about it, you freeze or you shut down or you're like, I'm not going to talk about God. And see, the thing is, we're going through this series called Know God, right? And it's how the different ways that we can know God is real and actually know him in a more intimate way and actually really have a good relationship with him. And so the first week, Stephen talked about knowing God through creation and seeing him in nature. Last week, Josh talked about knowing God through, actually, I guess it was flipped, right? Josh talked about it the first week, but Josh talked about knowing God through prayer and through reading your Bibles. And tonight, I want to say that you can know God by talking about him. And the more you talk about God, the more that you're going to understand him. I was a history teacher, and when I would teach my classes, a lot of times I would give these units to my 8th grade classes, and what I would do is I would break them into groups, and I'd say, okay, group 1, you're going to do a little bit of research on this subject, right? In group 2, you're going to do a little bit of research on this subject, in group 3, and so on and so forth. And then what I would have them do is come up, and they would nominate one expert to present. Now, was that person a complete expert on the topic I gave them from 10 minutes previous? No, right? They didn't know everything there was to know, but they knew enough to start talking about it. And the thing is, the students that would then get up and start to talk about it, I would learn over time, they retained or took in more information over time than the ones who didn't talk about it out loud. Because there's something about saying something out loud that causes your brain to react in a certain way and cause some retention. And so the more you talk about something, the more you know it. And the more you know something, the more you're going to want to talk about it. It's one of these cycles, right? The more you know something, the more you want to talk about it. The more you talk about something, the more you know it. That's why they say the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so tonight I want to tell you guys that for God, you can know him more by talking about him. But that might sound really intimidating to you. And it might sound really scary to you. And there's 4 reasons why I think a lot of times we hesitate when we talk about God. And the first one is I think that we don't know what to say. I think that a lot of times we don't know what to say. And you might get asked a question or a pastor or some speaker gets up and starts speaking some Christianese at you and it sounds like a foreign language and you're like, what's sanctification? That's a weird word. And you start wondering what he's talking about, or your friend is like, do you know the Holy Spirit? And you're like, I know the Muffin Man, but that's about it. And you don't really know what they're talking about and you get really confused, so you might not know what to say. And then second, you're afraid it could be awkward. Like you don't want an awkward situation. Nobody likes awkward situations. I mean, some people kind of do, but most people really don't like uncomfortable situations. So you don't want to put yourself in a position where it might be uncomfortable. You don't want people to be offended. You don't want people to maybe not be your friend anymore. You don't want to look stupid or foolish, so you don't talk about it. Or number 3, maybe you're not sure you have the right information. You'll think that you'll have this kind of daydream that you'll get partway through talking about God, and then partway through talking about God, you'll run out of the right things to say. You're like, I don't know, maybe I won't be able to say the right thing to this person anymore. And so you stop being totally sure of it yourself, and so you stay silent. And then number 4, maybe you don't know what you think. Maybe you don't know what you think about God. Maybe you have more questions than answers. Maybe you're not even a Christian yet. Maybe you don't even know if you believe in God. So you're like, why would I talk about something I don't believe in? And so you stay silent. And so many times we treat God like he's this algebra equation, right? You know algebra. 6th graders, you'll get it in a few years and it's terrifying, okay? So algebra, like the letters and numbers, right? That they're an equation, a math equation. And so we try to fill it out. And if we don't have all the right answers, we don't think we can talk about it at all. We need all the steps to it. And we think we need all the details. And until we have the answer 100% right, we just refuse to talk about it. But when you've experienced something awesome, you want to tell others about it, right? Like, think about a time that you went on a trip that was really, really fun. One of the first things you want to do when you get back is tell people about the trip you went on. And so for some of you guys, you've experienced something really awesome with God, and you don't have to know everything there is to know about God to tell someone about it. For some of you, you've never experienced something awesome with God. You've never really felt his presence. But maybe for you, you talking about God is asking someone who has experienced that. Hey, what do you do to get close to God? How do you know that God is real? That's still talking about him. And that's engaging and talking about him. So in the Bible, there's this book called Acts. And it's after Jesus leaves the earth, and there's these two guys, Peter and John. They're part of some of his disciples, the followers of Jesus, and they're walking around and telling everyone about Jesus. And there's some really stuck-up religious leaders, like guys who are like holier than thou, and they walk around and they have all these rules, and they're called the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees come up, and they see that Peter and John are telling everyone they can about Jesus. They can't shut up about it. They're running around. And then in Acts 4:13, they say, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished and took note that these men had been with Jesus. So Peter and John were just uneducated, just simple fishermen that had been with Jesus. But the more that they shared, the more that they knew Jesus. And the more that they shared, the more people around them knew that they had something different and that they wanted that. And so I want to tell one more story, and it's found in the book of John in the Bible. I'm not going to read it tonight, but I would encourage you guys in your hub groups to read it. It's found in this, or on your own later this week. So it's from the book of John, and it's John chapter 9. And so my 8th grade hub group and I, we've been reading through the book of John, just a chapter a day. And so this is one of the chapters we read this week. And I just love this story. And so I'm just going to retell it for you a little bit. So Jesus is walking around with his disciples, his posse, right? His people that follow him. And he's got his 12 disciples, and they walk up, and they see a blind beggar on the side of the road. Because back then, the only job a blind person could actually have is just begging for money. They couldn't have a job. No one wanted blind people around. They were rejects and outcasts, and a lot of people felt that if you were blind, you did something to deserve it. And it was a really backwards way of thinking, but that's how they thought back then. And so Jesus and his disciples see this blind guy. And Jesus immediately goes up to him and talks to him, which is something that's really cool because sometimes, even as Christians, we try to steer away from people who are different than us or people we think are like outsiders. But what Jesus does is he walks straight up to the outsider and says, hey, how are you? What do you need? How are you doing? And when as Christians, we want to follow that model of Jesus, right? So we want to go to people who are hurting, who are broken, and say, hey, how are you? How are you doing? And so Jesus does that. And his disciples walk straight up to him, and the blind guy is right there. The disciples are right there. The blind guy can hear them, and they go, hey, Jesus, who sinned so that this guy would be born blind? Him or his parents? In other words, who screwed up so that he's born blind? And they say it so the guy can hear. That's pretty messed up, right? Like, the blind guy is like, I'm right here, bro. Like, and so Jesus says to them, he says, look, it wasn't that he sinned. It wasn't that his parents sinned. It was that sin in this world definitely causes a lot of damage and pain and suffering, but specific suffering is typically not a result of a specific sin. Some of you have suffered based on your circumstances in your life, but it's not something that you did to bring it about. And so sometimes Jesus allows this suffering, and so what Jesus does in this moment is so weird, but he sees this just area of clay on the ground, some dirt, and Jesus hawks a loogie, he just spits into the ground, and then he makes some mud out of the ground. And the poor blind guy's like, why did I just hear spit? What is happening? And Jesus gets some mud on his hands, some spit mud, and he puts it on the blind guy's eyes. And the blind guy's like, what is this? And Jesus is like, it's mud, man, spit mud. And then the blind guy's like, why did you do that? And Jesus is like, hey, I want you to go take that mud that I just put on your eyes, that really gross spit mud, and I want you to go wash it off in this pool over here. So the blind guy goes and washes it off in the pool, and then all of a sudden he can see. And so Jesus performs this miracle, and he gives this guy his sight back. And so the guy is running around being like, I can see. And all these people who knew him as this blind beggar are like, wait, are you the same guy that was blind? He's like, yeah, that's me. I'm like, how did that happen to you? And he said, this guy, Jesus, put some spit mud on my eyes, and then all of a sudden I washed it off, and then I could see. And so the Pharisees, they overhear this. And they're those like stuck-up religious dudes again. And they had a lot of rules. They had rules on top of rules on top of rules on top of rules. They had a rule for everything. And there was this day called the Sabbath, which was this day where you're supposed to rest and do nothing and only reflect on God and no work at all. And Jesus healed this guy on the Sabbath, and they said, that's work because you made mud. That's work. And so they come up and like, who did this to you on the Sabbath? They don't even care that this guy just regained his sight. It's a full-on miracle, and they don't even care. Some of you guys have seen God evident in your friends' lives or the people around you. You just don't care. You're like those Pharisees. You're walking up, you're like, oh, dude did this to you. And the blind guy says, Jesus, this guy named Jesus did it to me. He put the mud on my eyes, the spit mud, and then I went and go wash it off. And so then the Pharisees say back to him, so he's a sinner because he did this on the Sabbath. He made mistakes because he did on the Sabbath. He broke the law. And so this guy says, I love this line, he says, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I used to be blind, and now I see. So the Pharisees are like, oh, that's a good line. And they're like, how do we catch this guy in a trap? Oh, I know, we tell his mommy. So the Pharisees go, and they go to the man's parents, and they bring the parents over, like, hey, come here, parents, blind guy, beggar. And they're like, hey, is that your son over there? And they kind of like when people like go into the courthouse and they have to point out like who the criminal is, right? Like, who's the criminal? Is that your son? So they bring him in, like, point to him. Is that your son? And so the parents do. They're like, yeah, that's our son. Whoa, Johnny, you can see. That's cool. And the parents are like, who did that to him? And the parents are like, how do I know? Go ask him. He's an adult. And the Pharisees are like, yeah, I guess we should. So they go to ask him again. They're like, hey, who did this to you? And the blind guy's like, I told you it was Jesus. Jesus is the one who did this to me. And they go, well, is he a sinner? And the guy's like, we had this conversation. And you didn't believe me last time. What, do you want to be his disciples? I love it. The blind guy's just trolling them, right? He's like, you want to be his disciples? Is that why you're so interested in Jesus? Like, oh, we don't want to be his disciples. We're trying to figure out who he is. And so the blind guy said, so they say again, there's no way that Jesus is from God, because if he was from God, he would not have worked on the Sabbath. And the blind guy says, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This guy healed my blindness. There's no way that he's not from God. And you know what the crazy thing about this is? The blind guy who was blind and now he can see, he's talking about Jesus, and he's not a follower of Jesus yet. He doesn't know that Jesus is God. He's not a Christian. And he's still talking about him. And so the Pharisees are like, ugh, that's dumb. And they kick him out of the church. Because sometimes talking about Jesus can be hard. And sometimes it does have some consequences to it. So they kick him out of the church, and the blind guy is sitting out there outside the church, but he can see again. And Jesus comes up to him and tells him who he is. I'm the Son of God. And the blind guy worships him in that moment because he's regained his sight. So Jesus has healed his physical blindness, and he's also healed his spiritual blindness. And this guy can be made whole again. I'm going to invite Jared up. He's going to sing one more song for us tonight. And I just want us to focus on two big things from tonight. Because I want you to know, like, who is standing next to Jesus this entire time he's healing this blind guy? Are those two guys I talked about earlier, Peter and John, who were going around after Jesus left telling everyone about him? Why? Because they'd seen what Jesus had done. They didn't know everything about Jesus. They weren't the smartest people in the world. They didn't have big theology degrees. They didn't know every part of the Bible forwards and backwards. They didn't have all these different textbooks on how to study God. But they started with something. They started with what they did know. And so the big two things I want you to take away tonight is, first, you don't need to know everything to talk about something. You don't need to know everything. Just start with something. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And the second big thing I want you to take away from tonight is, when you don't know the what, focus on the who. There's going to be times where you're not going to know all the answers. You won't be able to explain to your friends every single part of the Bible. You don't need to worry about that. For you, it might just be, I don't have all the right answers, but I know who Jesus is. I don't have everything dialed in, but I know that Jesus has answered a prayer for me before. Let me tell you about it. I don't know all the books of the Bible in order. But you know what I do know? I know that at youth group one time I had this moment where I felt that God was speaking to me. Let me tell you about it. You may not know all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled or even what the word prophecy really means. But what you might say is, I know that God loves me. Let me tell you about it. You don't have to know everything. We just start with something. Let's sing one more song together.